Like off-road party.
I was flying. You guys are dropping the fly. I was gonna get you. A long time ago. A long time ago. Everybody,
Hey.
that's now talking. What do you do? Like, what's so bad on? Maybe today, put a pocket on the plate and go down. I didn't know.
Happy birthday! It's my mom's birthday. Dr. B, it's my mom's birthday.
Your mom's birthday? Okay.
Dr. B, you
Well, then
lied.
here, you get going.
Yes, I was there and he asked. Right.
That's okay.
No, it's not.
Michaela feeling any better?
I'll take the fall for all of them.
No, not really. She went home this past weekend and her cousins that are just younger kids are the ones that got it first and gave it to everyone. It was only like a 24-hour thing with them, so hopefully it's
Probably some sort of norovirus,
yeah.
something like that, no walk, something like, yeah. But those stink. They just stink.
Yeah, she's pretty miserable.
You're
She's
miserable, just miserable. So,
What the heck?
hey, Bracken,
Hey, Dr. B, how are you?
better than I deserve.
Fair enough.
Okay, guys, are the slides moving?
don't appear to be, no.
They're not, okay. Then let's try this. Okay, now they're moving.
Nope, not that I
Oh.
can see.
That is a negative.
All right, now they're moving. Still not moving.
No, it acted like it was going to open the screen that it usually does, but it didn't. It doesn't look like it's in presentation mode right now. It just looks like you're on where you would edit your PowerPoint.
Oh, gosh.
There you go.
I'm just gonna have to keep it this way. I can't do presentation because if I do it, it doesn't work. So that's all there is to it. So
I don't know, unless it opens like a separate window that you have to share the screen when you hit presentation mode. That's the only thing I could think of, but
still not moving?
nope.
Okay. Well, then that's what we'll do. We'll just leave it there.
Okay.
Okay. Today, we're going to talk about the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system. So this regulates things that you don't have to think about. So when you think autonomic, think automatic. Automatic. So the things that you don't have to think about involve the beating of the heart, the operation of smooth muscles, the operation of glands, breathing, or at least when you're asleep, and things like that. Well, also when you're awake to some extent, you don't really have to think about that either. These are all things that are controlled by the autonomic nervous system. So when you think of the motor system, the motor somatic nervous system, you have a motor neuron. That motor neuron issues from the ventral side of the spinal cord. It innervates some sort of muscle. And then the sensory neurons have a dendrite that then attaches to a very long axon that goes back to a pseudo-unipolar neuron, the cell body of which is in the dorsal root ganglion. It will then synapse with another neuron. It enters through the dorsal side. The autonomic nervous system is different. So you have your main cell body of the nerve, essentially. There is a cell body in the spinal cord, or in some cases in the hypothalamus or something like that. You will have from the cell body, you'll send an axon. That axon will then synapse with another neuron. So this particular neuron that starts in the spinal cord, that's called a preganglionic autonomic neuron. It will then synapse with a so-called postganglionic neuron, and that synapse is with the cell body that's found in some sort of ganglion outside the spinal cord or brain. So that initial synapse from spinal cord to outside the spinal cord is in a ganglion. That ganglion is either, as you can see here, as part of this chain ganglion, as part of these paravertebral bodies, might be a celiac ganglion, might be a ciliary ganglion in the eye. Some organs have ganglions inside them for this very purpose. That synapse will be in that ganglion. The neuron whose axon comes to the ganglion, that's a preganglionic neuron. Its cell body is in the spinal cord. The neuron that emerges from that ganglion and then innervates its target, that's a postganglionic neuron. The postganglionic neuron will have its cell body in the ganglion, and its axon will then innervate the target. This is very common throughout the autonomic nervous system, this preganglionic, postganglionic structure. It's very different from, say, a motor neuron, where your cell body is in the spinal cord. You have this long axon that then, say, in some cases goes all the way down to your legs and innervates your big toe or something like that. In this case, you have this 2 neuron pathway. So motor neurons can be somatic, as in the case of ones that stimulate voluntary muscles, or they can be autonomic. So as we saw before, the somatic neurons, they have their cell bodies in the spinal cord, no surprise there. They send their axon out through the ventral root. They innervate their muscles, and the muscles are under voluntary control. That is very different when you look at the autonomic nervous system, where you have these 2 neurons that work kind of in a 1-2 punch. The type of synapse that you have with the smooth muscle is also very different than what you have with the muscle. We'll look more at the type of synapse you have between a motor neuron and a muscle. You have a specialized structure called a motor end plate. Here, you simply have an extended branched axon, and it releases its neurotransmitter kind of en masse to the smooth muscle or the gland. You don't have a specialized structure that involves the junction between the autonomic nerve and the target. So this is table 9.1 from your book. Spend some time with this table. So your effector organs in the case of somatic motor neurons are skeletal muscles. For autonomic nerves, they are smooth muscle glands, cardiac muscles, stuff like that. You do not have intermediary ganglia when it comes to somatic motor neurons. They go straight from the spinal cord to their target. With autonomic nerves, you always have an intermediary ganglion, always. Always. Specialized motor end plate when it comes to the neuromuscular junction, not the case with autonomic nerves. Your motor neurons will elicit an excitatory postsynaptic potential in their target. Autonomic nerves might be excitatory, might be inhibitory. So they can be one or the other, depending on the receptor. Your nerve fibers for your somatic nerves are fast conducting, usually myelinated. Autonomic nerves, typically slow conducting. You might have some light myelination, but the conduction is not as fast as the case with the somatic motor neurons. Now, the effective denervation, it's going to depend if it's upper or lower motor neurons, but if it's lower motor neurons, you'll get flaccid paralysis of the targets. Whereas with upper motor neuron damage, you'll have increased tone and decreased control and that sort of thing. Whereas if you have damage to the autonomic nerve, you get hypersensitivity of the target. That's very different than what you get with motor neuron. All right, so the pre-ganglionic neuron will synapse with a post-ganglionic neuronal cell body in the autonomic ganglion. And from there, it will go to its target tissue. You can see here, some of these are going to synapse within this particular paravertebral. All done? Very good. Cheers. They'll synapse with this paravertebral body. Others, however, are going to pass go and collect $200 and then synapse with a ganglion elsewhere. This is the case for this celiac ganglion. And the particular cells that are postganglionic are in the dotted lines here. Notice they are synapsing with preganglionic neurons whose axons go to the paravertebral body here. They then go to their target wherever it is. This one goes through and then will synapse in this collateral ganglion. The celiac ganglion and the paravertebral body, they're both autonomic ganglia. They just happen to be in different locations. So preganglionic neurons originate from the hypothalamus and then all the way from about the fourth cervical level or so of the head, neck, and abdomen, so on and so forth. And then they'll go from T1 all the way to L2. T1 all the way to L2. And then you have some others that go from S2 to S4. And you have chains of autonomic ganglia that will parallel the two sides of the spinal cord as well. We'll talk about those in here just a bit. The autonomic nervous system is two divisions: sympathetic, parasympathetic. Sympathetic and parasympathetic. This picture, taken shamelessly from your book, shows the two divisions in different colors. Parasympathetic autonomic nerves are shown in blue. Sympathetic autonomic nerves are shown in red. Look at that distribution and tell me what you see anatomically. They come from different parts of the nervous system, don't they? Parasympathetic comes from what? Where? Yeah, it comes from the two ends, doesn't it? Whereas in the middle, you have your sympathetic preganglionic nerves. So the mid part, that's sympathetic. Parasympathetic tends to come from the two ends. So think of a sandwich. Here's the bread, there's the ham or peanut butter jelly or turkey or whatever, ham and cheese, whatever. Think of the sandwich. The bread is the parasympathetic, the meat or cheese or whatever is the sympathetic. All right, now, one of the things both of these divisions has in common is that you still have preganglionic neurons, and the cell bodies of preganglionic neurons are found in the spinal cord or the midbrain, or in some cases, the hypothalamus or something like that. All of them have postganglionic neurons that are found in autonomic ganglia that are outside the central nervous system. Your sympathetic nervous system is also called the thoracolumbar division because it goes all the way from T1 to L2. So its preganglionic fibers originate in the spinal cord. They will emerge through the ventral root, and they will form they'll pass into a set of autonomic ganglia that are found on either side of the spinal cord. Because of COVID, you guys weren't allowed to dissect cats, but had you dissected cats and had you gotten to the back wall, you'd have had to essentially clean the back body wall, and on either side of the spinal cord, you would have found some white cords on either side of the spinal cord. I remember when I was in graduate school, I was TAing an anatomy class, and a student looked at me, called me over with a white face saying, "I damaged the spinal cord. Look, the spinal cord's outside. I wrecked the spinal cord." I said, "Nope, See this vertebra? See that? See that? See that? Are they broken? No, that's not spinal cord. Well, what is it then? So those are paravertebral bodies. You've uncovered the paravertebral body. Pat yourself on the back and get back to work. And this young lady had spent a lot of time cleaning, because you've got to really clean. There's a lot of fascia and fat and all kinds of other rubbish essentially over those things. They're very hard to see and they're fragile too. They're very easy to damage. So these bodies are called paravertebral ganglia. Sometimes they're called chain ganglia because they're all attached together and they form essentially a set of ganglia that look like a chain of ganglia. So paravertebral bodies, paravertebral ganglia, or chain ganglia. Those are the main autonomic ganglia of the sympathetic nervous system. Not the only ones, they're the main ones. There are others. And your book here essentially shows you that they are right up against the vertebral column, and that's where you see them. And so you can see them here like that. Your spinal nerves come out like that, and you can see that these are essentially in a position to very easily communicate with those spinal nerves. Because the paravertebral ganglia are all attached like that, the sympathetic nervous system is going to tend to be activated altogether. It'll tend to be activated as a unit. And this is called mass activation. This is a feature of the sympathetic, but not the parasympathetic nervous system. Mass activation. And think about it. Since the sympathetic nervous system mediates the fight or flight response, you would want it to show mass activation. Because all these things that are going to help you to either run from the Spring Arbor cougar or fight the Spring Arbor cougar, those are things that have to all work together. You have to have glucose for your muscles. Your muscles have to have extra blood supply. You need your heart to beat faster. You need your bronchial tubes to dilate so you get more oxygen in. Those are all things that have to work together. That's why you have mass activation. These essentially show you some of the origin of some of the preganglionic fibers and where they end up. There are cervical ganglia that are used to innervate things like the muscles of the eye and other parts of the face and neck and things like that. Heart and lungs, you go through the paravertebral ganglia, and then same thing with the upper extremities. When it comes to the abdominal viscera, you start to have collateral ganglia. You have celiac, superior mesenteric ganglia. And then the urinary tract, you have celiac and inferior mesenteric ganglia. And then the lower extremities, you have the paravertebral ganglia from the, so three of these you can see use paravertebral ganglia. So you have cervical ganglia, celiac, and then two mesenteric ganglia. Yeah, Evan?
Doesn't activate everything, like fight or flight? Is there an instance where it could be like half and half, like, or is it only one straight?
Pretty much one way straight unless you have damage to one of the fibers for whatever reason. If that's the case, then you won't have mass activation. So one of the things the sympathetic nervous system tends to do is it tends to shut down your GI tract because it diverts blood elsewhere. Now, those of you who are athletes, have any of you not listened to your coach and had a nice bunch of stuff to eat before you went to practice? You know, maybe puke on the practice field? Yeah, because that food is in your GI tract and now your GI tract is not active. Blood has been removed from it. So food now is going to irritate your tract, your GI tract. And so fight or flight, it's survival. will survive and eat later, what's your response going to be? Your GI tract. Reverse peristalsis, and up it comes. That's why your coach probably told you something like, please don't eat like an hour or something before you come to practice. That way you don't puke on the pitch, you don't puke on the diamond, you don't, whatever Brooklyn's looking at me just to say, ooh, this is too close to home. That's the reason, because this mass activation, when the coach makes you run wind sprints and reindeers and Indian run and stuff like that, that stuff is going to also shut down the GI tract, and food in there will irritate it. Any questions about the sympathetic nervous system, at least the structure of it, before we get to the parasympathetic? So the parasympathetic division, because its anatomical location tends to be in the brain, midbrain, what have you, in the sacral part, it's sometimes called craniosacral division. That's more of an anatomical designation rather than a functional designation. So its preganglionic fibers will originate in the brain stem, and then the S2 through S4 levels of the spinal cord. The autonomic ganglia for your parasympathetic nerves are different, or a right bit different than those used by the sympathetic nervous system. Here's why. With the parasympathetic nervous system, your ganglia tend to be right up against the organism they're servicing. So your preganglionic fibers tend to be really long. Your postganglionic axonal fibers tend to be really short. With the sympathetic nervous system, it's the opposite. Preganglionic fibers tend to be pretty short. The postganglionic fibers tend to be pretty long. So you go from the spinal cord to the paravertebral body. That's not a very long walk. Then you go from the paravertebral body to your target organ. That's a longer walk. With the sympathetic nervous system, you have so-called terminal ganglia found in or right up against the organ that they're meant to service. So you have long preganglionic fibers, short postganglionic fibers. It's an important anatomical difference between those two branches of the autonomic nervous system. Sympathetic nerve fibers will travel with spinal nerves. So if you consider spinal nerves, C7 through, whatever, T1, blah, 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 you'll have sympathetic nerve fibers that travel with them. Parasympathetic fibers very often don't. So they go their own way. Consequently, there are some parts of the body that are going to receive sympathetic innervation, but not parasympathetic innervation. Case in point, sweat glands. Sweat glands receive sympathetic innervation. They don't receive any parasympathetic innervation. Adrenal glands receive sympathetic innervation, but not parasympathetic innervation, and so on and so forth. There are 4 different cranial nerves that contain preganglionic parasympathetic fibers. So they are the oculomotor, facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus nerves, 3, 7, 9, and 10. So the first 3, 7, and 9, those are going to synapse and ganglia located in the head. Terminal fibers in the head typically. So they essentially will be located in very widespread parts of the body and so on and so forth. The vagus is going to wander all over the body. So its parasympathetic fibers are going to then synapse in terminal ganglia that you find in lots of places. The oculomotor nerve nucleus has both motor and parasympathetic fibers. The nucleus for the oculomotor nerve is right underneath where the optic chiasm is on the brainstem. In fact, if you look at a brain and you see the optic chiasm, usually you'll see these whiskers kind of coming out just below. Those are your oculomotor nerves. So they're very close essentially to where the optic chiasm is. These particular parasympathetic fibers are going to synapse in a terminal ganglion that's very close to their target. So the eye, the ciliary ganglion is just outside the eyeball. In fact, it's right kind of, this is the eyeball, it's kind of like right there. On the other eyeball, it's like right there. So it's right on top of the eyeball. The ciliary ganglia, after you get the preganglionic fibers synapsing in the ciliary ganglia, their postganglionic fibers will innervate both the ciliary muscle that helps with accommodation. Next week, we'll do an accommodations lab. In fact, there's a very easy way to do an accommodation. You can just tell people, okay, look at the in the title there, focus on that. Now focus on the top of this right here. And focus on the controller, focus on the controller. That's accommodation, near, far, near, far, near, far. Then as you get older and your lens starts to get stiffer, it starts to become near, far, near, far, near, far, near, far. And then you get what my wife calls short arm disease. Your arms are too short to be able to read it. And you need usually little magnifiers, 5 cents, $5 nowadays. Readers that you can just get at Walmart or something like that. And then you do what my brother does, you have them all around the house and you lose them. And so you hopefully have them. My sister-in-law just puts them on top of her head. And so she's always, oh, there they are. So I can, read the paper and stuff like that. I'm blessed with nearsightedness, so I just do this and I can see just fine, at least up close. Far away, forget it. But they also innervate the constrictor muscle of the iris. So parasympathetic input to the constrictor will cause the eye to essentially cinch down. One of the signs of chronic opiate abuse is this condition called meiosis. Notice that's different than meiosis, that goes on in gametes. This means a chronically pinpoint pupil, and that's even if you shine light on them. So if somebody tells you, oh, I haven't been using, and you notice they've got pinpoint pupils, they are lying to you, simply because the opiates will tend to prevent sympathetic input to the constrictor, to the dilator of the iris of the eye, so you get these pinpoint pupils. And that is a sign of, in fact, if someone's been using, one of the first things you do is you look them in the eye. You look at that pinpoint pupil. Okay, a little anatomical feature here. So the oculomotor nerve, the motor fibers are in the center. The parasympathetic are on the outside. So if you get a tumor that impinges on it, the motor function will not be affected. So people will still be able to follow your finger, but the pupil will be dilated. That's called a blown pupil, a blown pupil. And if you see a blown pupil, an eye that's dilated and doesn't go down no matter how much light you take out of it, that might be a sign they have an aneurysm or a tumor, or they might have an uncal herniation. And those are all very serious. They need to go see the doctor ASAP. If they have a blown pupil. If they have a blown pupil, it might be on one side, not the other. If you have blown pupils on both sides, you're in really big trouble. So, well, anyway. Okay, the facial nerve, these will originate in the pons, the preganglionic fibers, that is, their nuclei are in the pons. They're going to travel to the so-called pterygopalatine ganglion. The pterygopalatine ganglion is just above the palate and then over laterally a bit. That is going to send its postganglionic fibers to the nasal mucosa, the pharynx, and then, of course, the lacrimal glands. Yet another group of these fibers will terminate in the submandibular gland. That is one of the salivary glands. And that there is a submandibular ganglion that is very close to the submandibular salivary gland. So the submandibular salivary glands, if you go to the dentist and your dentist tells you to stick your tongue out and they look, one of the things they'll do is with a gloved hand, they'll press underneath your tongue. That's what they're feeling is the submandibular glands there, sublingual glands. They're looking for a hard spot. They're looking for a tumor in those glands. That's what they're doing. Even though it feels rather uncomfortable, that's one of the things they're doing. So these are innervated by the facial nerve and they help with salivation. Anticholinergic drugs will prevent proper salivation and they will cause a very dry mouth. And if you take any sort of anticholinergic drug, several drugs have anticholinergic properties. One of the big ones that people usually take is Benadryl, diphenhydramine. It causes a dry mouth. You wake up and you're like, oh goodness, give me some water. That's due to the fact that that drug has anticholinergic effects. One of the effects of that is a very dry mouth. The glossopharyngeal fibers, preganglionic fibers, they're also found in the brainstem and pons, and they will synapse in the so-called otic ganglion, and then it'll send postganglionic fibers, and it'll innervate that parotid gland. That is right here. And when the dentist feels the sides of your mouth there, the dentist is looking for hard spots essentially on those parotid salivary glands. And then the vagus nerve, the wandering nerve, and you can see from this picture taken from your book, all of this here, essentially, all of that, that's all vagus nerve. So it wanders here, it innervates, you can see the stomach and the heart and the lungs, and it's an everything sort of nerve. And the vagus nerve, it has very, 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 very long preganglionic fibers, and it's going to synapse with lots of different terminal ganglia in its various organs, very close to its various organs. So the organs the vagus nerve will service include the lungs, the heart, esophagus, stomach, pancreas, liver, small intestine, upper half of the large intestine. And each of these are going to synapse with terminal ganglia in or very close to those organs. And again, like good, solid parasympathetic nerves, your postganglionic neurons are going to have pretty short axons, unlike their preganglionic counterparts. From S2 to S4, you have the parasympathetic nerves. They're going to innervate the rest of the large intestine, sigmoid colon, and the rectum. They're also going to innervate the urinary tract, the bladder in particular, and then the reproductive tract as well. Once again, you have terminal ganglia on these. The preganglionic fibers will innervate preganglionic cell bodies in those terminal ganglia. The axon of those terminal ganglia will be pretty short. This really simply just restates the thing I just kept saying. Is that once again, you have these ganglia inside, visceral nerves, parasympathetic nerves, consist of preganglionic fibers, which is the opposite for sympathetic nerves because of the length. That same song, second verse there, just different way to say it. Okay, this is a table that comes from your book, and it shows you the different types of origins of the parasympathetic division, essentially where their terminal ganglia are, and then what they innervate, which is kind of what we just talked about. So the sympathetic division activates the fight or flight response. You'll get release of norepinephrine as a neurotransmitter, main neurotransmitter from postganglionic fibers. You'll also activate the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla will release epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream. Hence the big mass activation you get with activation of the sympathetic nervous system. Incidentally, one of the things activated by the sympathetic nervous system is the pilar erectus muscle that you have attached to your hair. And that's why activation of the sympathetic nervous system can cause the hair to stand up on the back of your neck. That's due to the pilar erectus muscle. This can also form goosebumps. And when you get goosebumps, that's either due to activation of because you're cold or because you're scared. So if you go see some really scary movie or something, you see, I don't know, whatever, something that scares you. Some of you look at me like I don't go to scary movies, but if you did, that's essentially what that response is from. So the sorts of things you're going to see with this, the heart rate increases, blood glucose increases, blood's diverted to skeletal muscles, respiration increases, peripheral blood vessels will constrict to send blood to muscles and things like that. Bronchial tubes will dilate. You'll get more oxygen into the bloodstream as well. All these sorts of things essentially to facilitate the fight or flight response. Parasympathetic nervous system does not undergo mass activation. It's parasympathetic, its postganglionic neurons will release acetylcholine from its postganglionic axonal termini. It, in general, will tend to slow the heart rate. It will tend to dilate blood vessels. It will tend to increase digestive activity. And so this part of this branch of the autonomic nervous system mediates the so-called rest and digest response, the rest and digest response. And this is an extremely useful table from your textbook. I would suggest you spend some time with this. It shows you essentially the innervation of these different structures and what activation of those particular branches does to them. Now, notice in many cases, the activity of these two branches is contrary. So with the heart, the sympathetic nervous system speeds it up and increases the force of contraction. The parasympathetic input, however, will slow the heart down and does not affect the force of contraction. When it comes to the eye, it'll dilate the pupil. In the case of the sympathetic input, it will constrict the pupil in the case of the parasympathetic input, and so on and so forth. Now, this is not always the case, but it very often is the case. In some cases, you'll see actually some collaboration between these two branches. And in some cases, you just don't have any parasympathetic innervation. So if we look at the liver, you'll notice that there's just no sympathetic, parasympathetic innervation of either the liver or adipose tissue. Same thing with sweat glands and so on and so forth. So the two neurotransmitters used by postganglionic neurons of the two is significant. This is a major physiological difference between these two branches. The postganglionic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system will largely use norepinephrine. There are a couple of exceptions to that, but it's usually norepinephrine, which sometimes gets called noradrenaline. The postganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic nervous system all use acetylcholine. Acetylcholine. So here you have this designation in your book. You can see the two branches of the parasympathetic nervous system, their postganglionic neurons, they release acetylcholine. However, the sympathetic nervous system's postganglionic neurons, they're going to release norepinephrine. And then the adrenal medulla will release epinephrine, norepinephrine, really as hormones into the bloodstream. So drugs that activate the parasympathetic nervous system, they're going to be cholinergic drugs. Cholinergic drugs. If you want to inhibit the digestive tract, you would use anticholinergic drugs. Anticholinergic drugs. So let's say you have the form of irritable bowel syndrome that's characterized by diarrhea. So you have IBS-D. One of the drugs you would take is an anticholinergic. Acyclovir is an anticholinergic. Very widely used, reasonably well tolerated drug. That drug, however, is going to cause you to have a dry mouth. And it will affect your sweating. You'll get a lot warmer with that drug. However, if you have IBS-C, the constipation version of irritable bowel syndrome, now you want to take something that's more cholinergic to activate the GI system. How that works? When you have sympathetic nerves that pass through smooth muscle, very often you have axons that have little inflations on them. These are called varicosities. And the release of the neurotransmitter occurs at each of these little varicosities. So each of those little varicosities kind of acts like a synaptic terminal, if you will. So if we blow up one of those varicosities, we can see that we have the release of the norepinephrine in this case on the top, acetylcholine in this case on the bottom, from these varicosities. And we notice that the smooth muscle has receptors for each of these various neurotransmitters. This type of release of neurotransmitters, as the action potential passes down the axon, this is called en passant. En passant is French for on the pass. It's used usually as a chess term, where you take your piece and you move it past someone else's pieces. Your piece is en passant, usually. But it's also used physiologically, since a lot of the early neurological work was done by French chaps who gave it French names, and the names have stuck. The neurotransmitter comes from the varicosities, and that's essentially how smooth muscle gets exposed to the neurotransmitter kind of en masse, if you will. This is not the case with sympathetic nerves that innervate blood vessels. They essentially just have a long branched axon terminus that just releases it right into the blood vessel. You don't have essentially with varicosities in that cases. Also, sympathetic fibers to sweat glands, they also don't release en passant as well. They just release at the axon tip. So the adrenal glands, as we said, is part of the autonomic nervous system. At least the inner part of the adrenal gland is. The inner part of the adrenal gland, if you look at a slice of adrenal gland, which I hope all of you remember when you looked at a slice of adrenal gland, the outside is very epithelial looking. The inside is very mesenchymal looking. The inside looks very much like nervous tissue in some ways. So whereas the adrenal cortex is formed from mesodermal tissue, it's formed from adrenal mesoderm, part of the intermediate mesoderm that makes the kidney. The medulla comes from neural crest cells that migrate into the developing adrenal gland and form the medulla. So it's actually derived from quasi-nerve cells. So these chromaffin cells of the adrenal medulla, they release epinephrine and norepinephrine when stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system. There is no parasympathetic input to the adrenal medulla, none. They're going to release epinephrine, norepinephrine in about a 4-to-1 ratio, roughly. So more epinephrine than norepinephrine. Okay, so norepinephrine might stimulate some receptors, but it might inhibit others, depends on the receptor. So there are two main subclasses of norepinephrine receptors. Now, these receptors will bind norepinephrine, they'll also bind adrenaline, epinephrine. Consequently, they're called adrenergic receptors because they bind adrenaline. So they're adrenergic, and the name has stuck. The two classes are alpha and beta. Alpha and beta. These alpha and beta receptors also have subtypes. There's an alpha 1 and an alpha 2 adrenergic receptor. And then the betas are divided into beta 1 and beta 2 receptors. There's an alpha 3 receptor. We're not going to worry about it. It's just found in the bladder. There's a beta 3 receptor. It's found in fat cells. We're not going to worry about it. So we'll just concern ourselves with, that's a bummer. Dropping your phone, never fun. Oh, okay, yeah. Beta 1 and beta 2 and alpha 1 and alpha 2 receptors. So if we have norepinephrine being released by these postganglionic neurons, if it binds target cells with alpha 1 adrenergic receptors, those tend to be found in smooth muscles surrounding blood vessels that feed viscera and the skin. So peripheral circulatory vessels. That causes vasoconstriction. Beta 2 adrenergic receptors, if bound by norepinephrine, that's also smooth muscle, and it's found in smooth muscle surrounding bronchioles and lungs, and also in the blood vessels that feed skeletal muscle. In that case, you relax the smooth muscle, and you get dilation of the airways and also of blood vessels that feed skeletal muscle. That's interesting. Same neurotransmitter, same cell type, smooth muscle, which get two completely different responses from the same neurotransmitter. What's up? What's up is two different receptors. Two different receptors elicit two different biological responses. Beta 1 receptors are found in the heart. They're going to cause the heart rate to go up, and they're going to cause the force of contraction to also go up. So you're going to pump a lot more blood. Your stroke volume is going to go up substantially. Okay, so the binding of these ligands, the norepinephrine, to the receptors is going to elicit changes in the concentration of this second messenger, cyclic AMP. The beta receptor is going to stimulate production of intracellular cyclic AMP. So in the cell, cyclic AMP levels are going to soar. Alpha-2 receptors, however, they're going to hamstring the production of cyclic AMP. Two very different intracellular responses. What's the hitch? The hitch is you have a different receptor. So the response you get is going to be receptor specific because that receptor is hooked to a different signal transduction machinery, depending on the cell type. Your alpha-1 receptor is going to cause internal release of calcium. That calcium is going to cause the smooth muscle to contract. That's why your vessels are going to cinch down. And that's why your alpha-1 receptors are going to cause contraction of smooth muscle. All right, so the effects, as you can see, of beta adrenergic activation are pretty complex because with beta 1, you get increased contraction and even greater robust contraction, a greater force of contraction of cardiac muscle. But with beta 2s, that's not the case. So here are some of the organs in your body, and here are some of their receptors. And this is table 9.5. Please take a good hard look at that in your book. Your liver, you see, has 2 different receptors. Notice that the beta receptor, beta 1s, are pretty much restricted to the heart. They're also found in the kidney, but we'll talk about those later. Alpha 1s are found both in the eye and also in the skin and visceral vessels. Skeletal muscles are going to have alpha 1 and beta 2s. Lungs are going to have beta 2s. Stomach and intestines are going to have alpha 1s, and then the liver kind of has 2 types, alpha 1s and beta 2s. Now, let's talk about molecules that are going to bind to these receptors and elicit particular responses that are given as drugs. Some of these molecules will bind to the receptor and they'll act like an activator of that receptor. Those types of molecules we call agonists. Other types of molecules will bind to receptors and they will not elicit a response. So they will block the native ligand from binding to that receptor and eliciting a response. This molecule, therefore, is going to get in the way of that native ligand. So it blocks that receptor from doing what it's supposed to do. That's called an antagonist. So propranolol is frankly, pretty heavily used drug. It's used as a prophylactic drug for migraine headaches. It's used for stage fright, for performers. It's used for people who have tremors, either from lithium or maybe other types of tremors. And it's also used as a blood pressure medicine. This particular drug binds to the beta 1 receptor and antagonizes it. Therefore, it lowers blood pressure because it lowers the heart rate. It blocks the beta 1 receptor. Now, unfortunately, this particular molecule can also block beta 2 receptors. Because you don't have beta 2 receptors dilating bronchial tubes, if you have asthma, this drug can make your asthma a whole lot worse. So that's a side effect, essentially, of a drug like this, based on the fact that it also will bind and block beta 2 receptors. Whereas atenolol is a drug very much like propranolol, but atenolol is specific for beta 1 receptors. So it will slow down the heart rate, lower the blood pressure, and it will not exacerbate asthma. This other drug that you see there, terbutaline, is a drug that is a agonist for beta 2 receptors. So terbutaline is used for very severe asthma. It's usually given as an injection, intramuscular injection. It's also used as a tocolytic drug. Because beta 2 receptors are found in the smooth muscle in the myometrium that surrounds the uterus. And if you bind the beta 2 receptor in the myometrium, you'll stop contractions. So this drug is given essentially to prevent premature birth, and it's used for asthma. But the side effect of that drug is it makes your heart jump out of your chest because your heart beats so fast, because it also binds the beta 1 receptor and activates it. So that'll raise your blood pressure and it'll prevent contraction if you get premature contractions. Phenylephrine, otherwise known as Sudafed. This will cause constriction of blood vessels. One of the places where it causes constriction of blood vessels are those blood vessels in the nasal mucosa. So this is often given as a nasal spray. If you get, waterworks going because of a cold, this stuff will dry you right up. Physicians will tell you, if you use this stuff, to only use it for about 3-4 days and no more, because it turns out your nose will get dependent on it. And now, if you don't use it, you'll have tremendous waterworks. So you're only supposed to use it now for 4 days. So Afrin is a nasal spray. It's not phenylephrine, but it's a closely related molecule like phenylephrine, and it's an alpha-1 agonist. What about the alpha-2 receptor? Now, the alpha-2 receptor is found in the central nervous system. The alpha-2 receptor is an autoregulatory receptor. Here's how an autoregulatory receptor works. So use your imagination, pretend this is a neuron. All right, so here's your axon. And when you get an action potential that goes down this axon, these norepinephrine-laden synaptic vesicles are released. That's due to the fact that you have this voltage-gated calcium channel that will let calcium into the cell, and that stimulates exocytosis. Many noradrenergic neurons have a have an alpha 2 adrenergic receptor. Once this cell releases norepinephrine, some of that norepinephrine will build up and then some of it will bind to this receptor. When it binds to this receptor, now this will send a signal into the cell that says, don't release any more norepinephrine. No more norepinephrine. And so this downregulates norepinephrine release. Clonidine and other drugs like clonidine are agonists of alpha 2 receptors. So they diminish norepinephrine release. So they can lower blood pressure. Clonidine is also used today as a treatment for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder because it modulates the release of noradrenaline and modulates hyperactivity and helps people focus. It's not first line for ADHD, but it is used. Very good. I believe that's all we have time for today. So I will see you guys on Friday. We have a test on Friday, so study hard. Did you all get my practice exam? Use that to help you study. Did you guys get the practice exam? You did. So use that to direct your studying and study hard and make me proud, okay?
We'll see you Friday.
Okay.